Thanks, Vadanya. Thank you. So just to repeat, a very warm welcome to everybody, a particularly warm welcome if this is your first evening here on Tuesday. So if this is your first evening, as Vadanya said, you've joined at the very beginning of a new series. And this series we're calling Living Buddhism. So what we're going to explore in this series is how we make our practice of the Dharma, how we make our Buddhism a real, living, alive thing in our lives. Something that really, we live, rather than, as it perhaps could be, something we sort of study, some sort of ancient thing that we study from a long time ago, a bit like a museum piece. How do we make it really vivid for ourselves, something that's, a really vivid part of our lives? So my talk tonight is entitled, if I can remember, right, I've lost the first sheet of my it's called Radical Dharma, Real Dharma. Yeah, it's called Radical Dharma, Real Dharma. So how do we make our Dharma radical? And I'll say a little bit about what that means, but also real. How do we make it real? And in asking that question, I'm also going to be looking at, why do we teach and practice what we teach and practice at this Buddhist Center? We've got a particular approach to the Dharma. Why is that? Where did that come from? How did it arise? And that's the same question in a way as how do we make our practice really vivid and alive? To look at that, first of all, let's go back to the time of the Buddha. Let's go back to where it all begins, the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha, as you almost certainly know, lived 2,500 years ago. I think this makes it something like Iron Age, in a very different part of the world, northern India, just adjacent to Nepal. And the Buddha, in deep meditation, had this breakthrough. He had this awakening, which is why he's called the Buddha. He awoke to the nature of things, the nature of reality. And as part of that awakening to the nature of reality, he saw that the rest of us have got it wrong. We got it all wrong. We're deluded. In fact, he described it as we see things upside down. And further than that, this seeing things upside down, this delusion causes us a lot of unnecessary suffering. So the Buddha had this breakthrough into the nature of things, and it was a direct experience. It wasn't working out a philosophical system. It was a direct experience of the nature of things. And at first he thought, well, I can't communicate this. If you think about it, you cannot communicate the nature of a direct experience. Think about trying to communicate the taste of a strawberry to somebody who had never tasted a strawberry. You could say it's a bit like this, you could say it's a bit like that, but there's nothing you could say that would give that person the taste of the strawberry. And in fact, there's a danger there that if they thought, I now know what a strawberry tastes like from the words, they'd never taste a strawberry. So you cannot communicate the nature of you can't communicate a direct experience, and that's what the Buddha had, a direct experience. So at first he thought, well, all these people suffering because of their upside down vision of things, but I don't know that I can do anything about it. I don't know that I can teach because I can't communicate this. But then we're told that he had a vision. And he had a vision of humanity as a lake of lotuses. Now, lotuses are like water lilies. They start out in the sticky, smelly mud at the bottom of a pond or lake. They grow up through the muddy water. They get to the surface and they open, and they're exquisitely beautiful. and they're completely unstained by the mud they came from, and all of the muddy water just rolls off them. They look like they've never touched a particle of dirt, but they're also exquisitely beautiful if you look into one. So we're told the Buddha saw humankind as a lake of lotuses. Some of us were still down in the mud. Some of us were growing up through the light at various stages. Some of us, some human beings, had reached the surface, were about to break the surface or had broken the surface and were ready to open in the sunlight. And the Buddha, the realization that came to the Buddha was that although he couldn't communicate the nature of that sunlight, what it was like to be in that sunlight, he could help human beings to grow up towards that sunlight. He formulated a Dharma to help human beings to grow. The Dharma is a horticultural manual for the cultivation of lotuses. Or actually, it's a horticultural manual for the cultivation, for the growth, how human beings grow, so that we can reach the point where we can see the nature of reality ourselves, where we can open up to the nature of reality, to the sunlight, and have the same awakening experience that the Buddha did. But of course, the Buddha needed to frame this set of instructions in a way that suited the world he lived in. It had to suit the way people thought, the way people felt, and the world he lived in. So one of the things about it, of course, is that he lived in a subtropical climate, and where there was a lot of wild forest, and where there was a culture of feeding homeless spiritual seekers. That was just part of the culture. So the Buddha taught a fast track. He also taught, he had followers who were householders, and some of them got a long way, but he taught a fast track. And the fast track was give it up. Just lose your worldly identity totally abandon your sort of egocentric desire for this, that, and the other. Go and live in the forest, sleep in the woods, and beg for your food. Become a homeless beggar. That was what he taught. That's the fast track. There were others who've practiced differently. Well, that was possible in that time and place. I'll let you imagine what it would be like in the UK today. I think that far from freeing us from the shackles or worldly whatever to focus on spiritual practice, it would take all our energy and time just to survive. Personally, it would make me seriously anxious. I don't think it would help. I don't think we can do it here. So the Buddha taught something that really worked at the time, but as it moved beyond India, it had to adapt. And it had to adapt not just to things like the local climate and the culture, but also to different ways of thinking that actually get embedded in cultures and in languages. It had to adapt to people with different conditioning, who thought in different ways and felt in different ways, who had different spiritual strengths and different spiritual weaknesses to overcome. So Buddhism expanded into Indochina, Persia, China, Mongolia, Japan, and as it spread, it adapted to that particular time and place, and that particular culture, and that particular language, and that particular way of thinking. And then centuries and millennia passed in a world with no mass communication and where travel was slow and difficult. So what happened was, having gone out and adapted in these various ways, these various forms of Buddhism were then pretty much completely cut off from each other. So they diverged. They diverged more and more. They got more and more different. Often, each one thinking it was the real Buddhism. And that's given rise to an incredibly rich but diverse tradition, which is a great help, which is a great thing, but it's also a bit of a problem for us. And now, after thousands of years, Buddhism's arrived in the West. And of course, what it arrives as, mainly, is as one or other of these cultural variants, one or other of these diverse traditions, which often look very, very different and often come mixed up with a big dose of the local culture. So we need to practice a real living Buddhism that works for us here and now. We need to do what others have done. We need to develop a style of practice that works for us here and now, and not in Iron Age India or medieval Tibet or Japan. And we've been given a great start in that by our founder, Sangha. So Sangha was he was a Theravada monk, so he was a monk in the tradition of Southeast Asia, who also had some of the most eminent Tibetan teachers of his era as close guides, and also had a teacher from the Sino-Japanese tradition. So he got exposure to a really wide variety of Buddhism, the whole sort of spread. And he obviously thought, and we've thought since, how do we do this? How do we get a practice that really is going to work here and now? And firstly, and mainly, that means we go back to the roots of what the Buddha taught. So radical means at the root. That's what it means. It's like radishes, their roots. Radical. I'm a botanist. I know these things. Radical means at the root. We get back to the root of what the Buddha taught. The two meditation practices that we've all learned go right back to the teaching of the Buddha, as do the 5 precepts, as do the wisdom teachings like the 3 marks of conditioned co-production, the 3 lakshanas, which we've all heard about. They're all there in the earliest texts that record what the historical Buddha actually said. And we also try to practice with the sort of spirit and ethos that the Buddha taught. The Buddha often advised his followers to practice not just for themselves, not just to be a little bit happier, not just to escape from suffering, but for the welfare of the many. Practice for the welfare of the many. And that's what we try to do. We also try to have that spirit of altruism and service in our practice, practicing for the welfare of the many, not just for ourselves. So, as I've said, these various later forms of Buddhism developed in a way that suited their time and place, but sometimes don't have any direct, obvious connection back to what the Buddha taught. They developed from it, but the connection's not that obvious. It's an incredibly rich tradition with many, many different practices and approaches. If you go to a Tibetan group or a Zen group or a Japanese Pure Land group or a Nichiren group, or a Theravadan group in Sheffield, and I'm sure there are all of these, you'll get something very different. You might end up finding yourself chanting something in Japanese and never learning to meditate. For example, these very, very different traditions. And it's incredibly rich. If you go online, you can get meditation practices from different levels of any number of different schools. And if we're not careful, we can try a bit of this and a bit of that. And when we get a bit bored with that, or it gets a bit difficult, we try a bit of that, like magpies. A bit of this and a bit of that as the urge takes us and we get nowhere. There's a sort of adage that if you want to get anywhere, if you want to find water, you dig in one place. You don't dig lots of shallow holes. There's nothing wrong with that diversity. That diversity is incredible richness, and it obviously worked in the places that evolved, but it can be very confusing. It can be very confusing. And we try to cut through this confusion by adapting and adopting some aspects of this rich tradition that have been shown to work for us here and now, and which are in accord with the Buddha's teaching, which are definitely in accord with the Buddha's original teaching. So that's one of the things we do. Secondly, we try to make use of aspects of modern society, modern Western society, or modern society that support and enhance the spiritual life. That's what Buddhism has always done. It did it in Japan, it did it in China. You can see that they fed on a local culture. They've used the aspects of the local culture that really work. And we've got a very, very developed culture. Some of it can be very helpful to the spiritual life. We've got a very well-developed artistic culture. Fantastic music, great music and poetry and art and literature, poetry, which can really help us to open up to what I can only call a higher beauty, open up to something higher than ourselves. And we'd be stupid if we didn't use it. We'd be stupid if we didn't use it. We've also got a highly developed spiritual culture, although it's always expressed itself in these theistic terms. There were people there seriously trying to practice something, and they always had to see it in those terms. But that's given rise to music and art and architecture, which can feed our spiritual imagination and which has got deep roots in us. So we need to use our culture. This is what happened in China and Japan, for example. And one of the things would be to open up to that, I think. So our culture can make it easier for us, or it can make it more difficult for us. I'll come back to some of the ways it can make it more difficult in a little while, but one of the ways that can make it easier is that we've got a lot of freedom. We've got a lot of freedom, which gives us a lot of freedom about lifestyle. So one example is that most traditional schools make a really sharp division, or many traditional schools make a really sharp division between monastics, monks and nuns, and householders. And usually the monastics seen as the real Buddhists. The householders often relegated to the task of supporting the real Buddhists who in monasteries. And these are monks and nuns. Of course, that's often equated with the followers of the Buddha, but of course the radical followers of the Buddha were not monks or nuns. They lived a much more challenging life than that. They didn't live in monasteries. They lived in the woods. But you do get this thing where very often there are monks and nuns, with incidentally, because of this culture of the time, the nuns always subservient to the monks. You get monks and nuns, and then you get lay people, and it's quite sort of a radical division. It's quite a sort of strict division, and this division is just not so relevant or practical here and now, as our lifestyles are much more fluid and flexible than in traditional societies. So, if you look at order members of our order, you see people who live a wide variety of lifestyles, from pretty much monastic, through people who live in communities like the community we've got here, through to people who are with families and careers very engaged and active in the wider society. Order members also sometimes spend some time as monastics and then go back and engage with the world, or vice versa. So there's a lot more freedom. That strict division is no longer relevant. So we describe ourselves as neither monk nor lay as an order. We're not monks. We're not lay in householders and in the traditional sense. So Sangha, our founder, said, okay, well, the order is neither monk nor lay. What makes a real Buddhist is their wholehearted commitment, not their lifestyle. He later added that lifestyle is secondary, but not unimportant, which I think is a useful little sort of addition. And anyway, the lifestyle is secondary, not unimportant, but lifestyle is secondary, and going for refuge is primary. There's a Buddhist code for that commitment, which goes back right to the time of the Buddha, which is this phrase, going for refuge. It means really being committed to the path. It arose from the time of the Buddha. So anyway, that's one area where, obviously our culture makes it a lot easier. There are other areas where we have different strengths and different weaknesses. Our style of practice needs to use our strengths, but also deal with our weaknesses. And one huge weakness that we suffer from in our society is the prevalent individualism in our society. I mean, it's almost shocking. You hear adverts, it's all about you. It's all about you. Everything's all about me, what I want, my preference. It's all about me. And this can lead us to try to create a Dharma, which is all about me. It's all about me. Making me feel better. My attainment. My meditation, my insight that I make a medal to pin on my ego to feel bigger when it's supposed to have the opposite effect. So this can have the effect of creating what I have called a near enemy of the Dharma. A near enemy of the Dharma in which, features of that would be solitary meditation is seen as all important. Meditation done in solitude. Sangha is seen as dispensable, totally dispensable, because people are just a bit challenging. Or if you do have to bother with people, you do it online. So why bother with the challenge of dealing with other people when it's all about me, let alone going beyond my egotism to actually help others, if it's about me? So why is that a near enemy? It's a near enemy because it focuses on me, it actually increases our egocentricity. It becomes just another aspect of our egocentricity. I can do what I want, doesn't have to challenge me. If a Dharma doesn't challenge us, it's not going to change us, basically. So yeah, we try and counter those tendencies to make a real Dharma that really makes a difference to us. We need to challenge that individualism in the way we practice. And one way we do this is to focus on the positive emotions that connect us to others, and therefore the metta bhavana. We live in a society where intellectual understanding is seen as all important, and where positive emotion is not always encouraged. As well as this individualism, there's a tendency to be highly critical of others, often to look to others for blame, look to blame others. And this can make us, quite frequently, in our experience in teaching in a Buddhist center, quite out of touch with our positive emotions, the positive emotions that connect us to others. And if we are a bit out of touch with our positive emotions, as many of us are, we may find the metta bhavana meditation difficult and unrewarding. And we may be tempted not to do it. And just stick to the mindfulness of breathing, which is such a delight, so relaxing, etc. But if we are tempted to skip the metta bhavana, this is precisely the reason we need to do it. The Buddha made it very clear that we won't get far unless, in a way, our heart is full of positive emotion. The positive emotions that connect us to others and the world around us. So if we want to make real progress, we need to do the metta bhavana, even if we find it challenging. A Dharma that's not challenging is a Dharma that has little power to change us. So we should do the metta bhavana, even if we find it difficult. In fact, we should do the metta bhavana, especially if we find it difficult. If we find it difficult, it's just what we need. So, in my experience, when I first learned to meditate, when I first went along to a Buddhist retreat, actually it was, I took to the mindfulness of breathing. Oh, this is wonderful. I'd done something a little bit like it in the past. I just thought, this is wonderful. I couldn't see the point of doing the metta bhavana. Why would I wish to feel good about others? I really couldn't see the point. But we were told alternate the practices. And I suppose I had a certain amount of trust, and maybe I was just being a good boy. So I alternated the practices. Lovely metta bhavana one day, really difficult lovely mindfulness and breathing one day, really difficult metta bhavana the next. But what I found was that when I stuck at it and when I used some creativity to get into it, the metta bhavana was far more transformative. It was just what I needed. It was far more transformative. So I'd really encourage you to stick with the metta bhavana, even if it seems to be difficult. Do what we used to say, just alternate the practices. I have to say, on the other side, of course, there are some people who find the metta bhavana really easy and find the mindfulness of breathing difficult. The same goes. Alternate the practices. So that is one way that we try to gear our practice to a weakness that's prevalent in our culture. And another way is by emphasizing the importance of friendship, community, and Sangha. So we see it as an important part of our practice as individual Buddhists to mutually create an environment in which we can all make progress. Mutually create a community that supports us all, mutually create a Sangha in which we can all grow. The Dharma tells us that we are not independent, standalone individuals. We are deeply connected to others and the world around us. We are part of others and the world around us, and others are part of us. And at a practical level, what that means is that we are just profoundly affected by other people. The other people that surround us and the environment we find ourselves in. If we change our environment, we will change. If we change the people we spend time with, we will change. If we don't change the people we spend time with to some extent, it's very, very difficult to make change if those people don't support our practice. If we don't put ourselves among people who support our progress in an environment that supports our progress, it is very difficult to make any progress at all. And what this means is that mutually bringing into existence the Sangha becomes as important as our individual practice, because without it, none of us get anywhere. So unless we practice as part of a Sangha, we are not going to get very far. Only very, very exceptional people can get far on their own. Maybe 1 in 1,000, I don't know, maybe 1 in 1,000,000, who knows, who absolutely knows. But there is a catch-22, and the catch-22 is that if we are 1 in 1,000, we wouldn't want to practice on our own anyway. If we're that 1 in 1,000, if we had any element of real sort of spiritual, we would see that we're deeply connected to others. We'd have a deep sense of solidarity with others, and we'd want to help others to grow as part of the way we practice, out of a deep sense of solidarity. We'd want to contribute to creating an environment in which we can all grow. So although there may be exceptional individuals who could make real progress on their own, if they couldn't find a context, the catch-22 is if we think that we are that individual, which we probably all do, and we're tempted to go alone, that is a sure sign that we're not that individual and we're not going to get anywhere on our own. That's a sure sign that what we precisely need to do to make any progress is to go beyond that individualism and join together with others in mutually creating a Sangha. We do this by contributing in any way we can, as more and more opportunities open up as we become more involved. We do it by relating to what is best in each other, not relating to what's lower. We do it by relating from what is best in ourselves, speaking positive, creating a positive spoken environment, if you like. We do it by just turning up. If folk don't turn up, we don't have a Sangha. And then none of us are getting very far. So we sometimes turn up for others, even if we don't feel like it. So it's very much our vision of the way we practice here. There's a sort of tradition in Buddhism about things called pure lands. So a pure land is in tradition, it's a place created by a highly developed being. It's a sort of environment in which their influence helps others to grow. And there's a text called the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutta, which reframes what they mean by a pure land. And he says, well, a pure land is not a place. A pure land is a community. A pure land is a community that's brought into existence by practitioners, by people. And Sangha, our founder, tells us what we should be doing in our Buddhist centers is creating mini pure lands. We're creating these environments that help us all to grow. We're creating, by mutually coming together, to create something that goes beyond all of us. And I think that is the way we really have a living, real practice of the Dharma, rather than just sort of trying to do it in our heads. Thank you.